I want to talk about criticality in relation to language and literacy, and talk a little bit about the problem of criticality and action, policy intervention and other forms of action. I had really hoped that I would have a lovely neat ending to my 10 minutes where I'd say, so this is how you do it. But, you know, yesterday a number of people were talking about science fiction stories that they'd been reading, and it reminded me of a story that I know, and I think Omara might know it, because we both probably taught it when we were English teachers. Did you teach Flowers for Algernon, Joe? Some of you may have read this story, which is the story of somebody who has an intellectual disability, is treated over a period and becomes, first of all, moderately smart, then brilliant, but then the treatment wears out and they become less and less smart until they resume their previous state of not very smart. I actually think that's me. I'm getting to the point where I think I know less and less about the things I profess about, and just at the point where I actually have the power, the influence, the opportunity and indeed the responsibility to intervene in policy debates, and am invited to do so, less and less do I know what I want to say. And that seems to me a really fundamental dilemma that I have as a critical scholar working in the area of language. And so I thought I'd just use this as therapy really, and speak to you about some of those dilemmas. Possibly in my field more than in others, in critical linguistics and critical language studies, critical became mainstream. There's critical discourse analysis, there's critical textual analysis, there's, as I say, critical applied linguistics, there's critical literacy, there's a whole sort of raft of stuff. And certainly in fields operating in Australia, but elsewhere as well, that criticality has just become a given. It's a mainstream way of dealing with language, and it's probably because the sorts of analyses that we do with language, even when that analysis is, as Peter Freebody said to me, knowing exactly what fraction of a second it takes to speak a word, which is a sort of startlingly quantitative way of doing qualitative research. Even when it's that kind of analysis, it still has a critical flavour. So criticality in language studies, criticality in linguistics probably doesn't have that sort of marginal positioning that lots of other critical studies have. It's now a brave person who talks about English as if it's one language. It's a brave person who talks about the grammar, the syntax, even the vocabulary. We're all into multiplicity. So concepts like Alastair Pennycook's concept of metrolingualism, which looks at linguistic hybridity in the cities, is seen as a very exciting and not particularly politically threatening concept. When I started to think through what I wanted to say about this and what was really troubling me about it, because surely that's a victory, isn't it? That there we are, you know, what used to be in the sidelines is now in the middle. I didn't go to Habermas, sorry. I went to Wikipedia and I typed in critical literacy, and this is what I got. It was so neat. I don't know what it means. Two major theoretical perspectives within the field of critical literacy are the neo-Marxist Freirean and the Australian. These approaches overlap in many ways, and they do not necessarily represent competing views. You'll be relieved to hear that. But they do approach the subject matter differently. The Australian? Catherine, they mean us. This is a very puzzling, but clear. You know how Wikipedia has those little notes on the top saying, this really needs more work? This one doesn't have that note. So this is the received wisdom. I found that fascinating, and perhaps an indication of the work that has been done in Australia in language and linguistics and the power that it has. If anyone wants to go back to that Wikipedia, you know, you can actually work on them. I think we need a bit more detail there. But I guess I wanted to use it to make the point that, yeah, we've had an effect. As a field, we have had an effect internationally on what constitutes a mainstream approach to language and literacy. But the crucial question, to use Chris's attempt to avoid using critical, the crucial question for me is, so what are we going to do about that? Okay, we're there now. What happens next? If there's one thing that has changed radically in the period that I've been doing this kind of work, it's the absolute ubiquity of the text. I say this as I read from my iPad when I look at people in workplaces, which is where I do a lot of my research. Textual work has replaced physical work and many other forms of work in ways that I would not have dreamed about when I first entered factories to look at what people were doing. It's not just that textual work records information and gives directions, it's actually the way that whole organisations organise themselves. It's the way that political systems work. The whole business of Twitter indicates a ubiquity of textual practice that I would never have guessed in terms of local organisation and in terms of much more overarching organisation. And that's an enormous challenge to education, I think. It stops language being a topic for discussion and becomes the very meat of what we need to do. One of the questions that we face as educators in any domain of education looking at language is, if you're actually going to intervene in language and the way that it works, how much do you need to know about how language works and how much do you need to know about the effects of language? And this is an issue that many curriculum areas are looking at. But what I'd like to do very quickly in giving you a sense of what I'm thinking about here is just to look at three different places where I've been faced with dilemmas about what a critical approach to language studies can offer the educative moments in these different contexts. The first is one that I may have mentioned to some of you because it struck me so much at the time. A little while ago now, several years ago now, I did work in various companies that were associated with the Ford Motor Company. And part of that work was looking at the way in which the Ford Motor Company Quality Manual actually governed the work practices of the people who were in that organisation and what it meant for the social and political organisation of the people who were working there, but also what it meant for their workplace English language and literacy programs and their executive education programs. And as you do, I became utterly connected to those companies and felt very attached to the people who were working there, and noticed particularly the way in which the blokes who used to be the warpers and the weavers, particularly the warpers in an automotive textile company, their position as the most serious and important worker on the factory floor was compromised because they couldn't fill in the forms. The women in the area were literate and could fill in the forms, and so they became to be seen as the people who had the knowledge about warping. I did quite a lengthy analysis about this, and I love talking about it still, but I'll strain myself to say that a couple of months after I'd given a paper about this, my mate Maston Prinsloo in South Africa said, "I want you to mark a thesis, trust me, you'll really want to do this one." And it came to me, and I did. I always trust Maston, I did as he told me. And he sent me a thesis that was about the same quality manual in a company in Cape Town, where it was an analysis of how that quality manual had affected the work practices and the social organisation of that particular workplace. And what it had done was change the racial hierarchies and the gender hierarchies in that organisation in a completely different way from the way that it had changed what was happening in Australia. Later, Maston and I had a moment where we were invited to talk with governments and the automotive companies about literacy in the automotive industry and what needed to be done about it, and we were paralysed because the effects of that was so great, that little trigger in that organisation was so great that you knew it would really matter what you said. It wasn't just a, well, here's my expert opinion about how you should go about training your folks for literacy in the workplace. It was bloody hell. This has had a very powerful impact on the social and political organisation of those people already at that local site. But it's utterly unpredictable how it will actually work. So I want 1 minute, 2 minutes, one more minute. So I'll only tell you one other thing. And Michael Singh, I'd like to talk with you about this at some point. A couple of years ago, I started work with 2 South Asian colleagues editing a book called English in South Asia. And our aim was to make sure that these were not Western scholars pontificating about English in South Asia, but South Asian scholars pontificating about English in South Asia from Pakistan and Sri Lanka and various other countries. My 2 co-editors, one was from Nepal and one was from India, we had extremely interesting conversations about the pieces that we're going to include in this collection, because I wrote my bit saying, you know, English has a very complicated relation in international education, and the matter of English as the language of instruction, and particularly English as a language of instruction funded by various international organisations, is very problematic, where people really, in my view, ought to be learning in their native tongue, certainly in their early stages. And all these guys said, nah, let's talk about how you teach English. You're talking about social capital here. So I found that a very confronting question. What am I going to say about this? This is our collection, and I'm feeling that some of these analyses were, from my point of view, not addressing the political context in which they were working. They were actually very pragmatic. But the really hard bit was when we decided what the order of the editors was going to be. And the 2 people that I were editing with said, you have to go first. Your name's clearly Western. I don't think that's a good idea. And another Professor Singh said to me, look, Lesley, it's okay, they'll think you're a bloke. So the order of the editors, I had to completely give in. It was amusing, but it's also really troubling to me. What was my role there? How do I actually intervene in that kind of really very small situation, but very complicated and challenging one for me? And as you can see, in that instance, I just capitulated really completely. I was going to talk about the Australian curriculum, but I'll leave that for someone else. So those are my dilemmas, and thank you for letting me share them with you.